You feel it before you name it. In the glance that lingers too long. In the silence after you speak. In the invisible weight that enters a room with someone more certain than you. It's not loud, this fear. It doesn't scream or claw. It tightens. Subtly. Like a thread being pulled from the inside, one you didn't notice until your breath shortens and your posture closes. 1,000 little concessions made in the name of harmony, or safety, or survival. You were taught to smile when you're anxious, to nod when you disagree, to shrink when someone stronger stands beside you. And somewhere along the way, that reflex became identity. Not because it's who you are, but because it's what kept you untouched. This world rewards the appearance of peace more than the reality of it. And fear, real, primal fear, doesn't always look like trembling hands or running footsteps. It looks like silence when you should speak. It looks like accepting terms that hollow you out. It looks like shaping yourself to fit the expectations of people who would never do the same for you. There are hierarchies built not with weapons, but with tone. With absence. With the cold engineering of consequences that never need to be said aloud. Most people will never hit you. They don't need to. They'll raise an eyebrow, withdraw their affection, offer you just enough approval to keep you obedient. And call it love. You obeyed because you were scared. Scared of being abandoned, scared of being misunderstood, scared of being wrong. And so you folded yourself smaller until your own edges disappeared. But survival isn't freedom. Compliance isn't respect. And the quiet submission that kept you safe once is now the thing keeping you imprisoned. This fear isn't yours. It was planted, cultivated, refined by families that taught obedience through shame, by systems that reward silence and punish authenticity, by people who could only feel big by making you feel small, and you internalized it, not because you were weak, but because you were unprotected. You didn't know you were allowed to say no. Didn't know you were allowed to be hard to understand. Didn't know you were allowed to be feared, because fear, in the right hands, is not cruelty. It's clarity. It's a signal to others that you are not to be moved unless you choose to move. That your mind is not terrain for them to walk upon. Freely. That your boundaries are not a request, but a fact. But you're not there yet. You're still breathing in the atmosphere of others' approval, still waiting for permission. Still mistaking comfort for safety, and that's okay, because this, the ache in your gut, the dissonance in your chest, the tightrope you walk between truth and acceptance, is the beginning, the seed. And seeds are not meant to be comfortable. They are meant to rupture. Let it. Let this fear be your first teacher, not to obey, but to observe. Because once you see it clearly, you'll never mistake it for truth again. You thought the world was built on rules, that fairness mattered, that loyalty was sacred, that people said what they meant and meant what they said. But you were only watching the front of the stage. Behind the curtain, something else was happening. A theater where masks were stitched from fear and faces were molded to fit rooms, where words were weapons dressed as kindness and silence was sharper than any blade. You thought power was loud. That it declared itself, that it forced its way in through threats and commands. But most power never raises its voice. It whispers. It smiles. It makes you doubt your own instincts. And this, the invisible hierarchy, the subtle exchanges, the unspoken contracts, is where power actually lives. A man walks into the room and doesn't say a word, yet somehow everyone orients toward him. Not because he demanded it, because he doesn't need to. People perform around power. They adjust. They laugh at the wrong moments. They flatter without knowing why. Not because they respect, but because they fear being unseen. And the ones who sit quietly, observing, unmoved, They are not indifferent. They are calculating. Because in this hidden theater, detachment is dominance. Emotion is a tell. You've done it too. You've smiled when you didn't mean it, nodded when you disagreed, laughed to make someone feel comfortable, even when you felt small in their presence, and you thought you were being kind. But what you were really doing was offering your power in pieces. This is not about morality. It never was. Because morality, too, is a costume, used when it benefits the play, abandoned when it doesn't. People do not reward you for being good. They reward you for being useful. And when your goodness no longer serves their script, the applause stops, the curtain falls, and you're left wondering why the story changed. Because the story was never real. Only the performance was. This is the rupture, the first crack in the glass. When you realize the reality you trusted was made of paper and stage lights. When you understand that people don't just wear masks, they become them, and in doing so forget there was ever a face beneath. The illusion of fairness, of justice, of loyalty, these are not foundations. They are tools. They are used by those who understand the script and rewritten by those who own the stage. And you? You've been acting in someone else's play, reading lines you never agreed to, playing roles you didn't choose. But the moment you see the set for what it is, the moment you realize that most people are not authentic, but rehearsed, you stop being a character and start becoming the director, not by force, not by shouting louder, but by no longer needing to be liked, by no longer apologizing for stepping off stage, by understanding that silence can make people speak, that stillness can unnerve, that presence, real presence, cannot be faked. Power isn't what you take. It's what you no longer give away. And the more you observe, the more you stay rooted while others perform, the more the theater reveals itself to you. You stop mistaking noise for truth. And in the stillness, you begin to rewrite the script. You've always felt it. Something just beneath the surface of words that didn't match the eyes. A smile that arrived half a second too early. A softness that seemed to wait for you to relax, just so it could push. You didn't have the language for it then. You only knew that after speaking to certain people you felt smaller, less sure, like something had been taken from you without ever being asked. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't use threats. They used confusion. And it worked. Because confusion isn't seen as violence. It's seen as your fault. This is the anatomy of the manipulator. Not a monster. Not a villain. Just a person, terrified of being powerless. So they learned how to hide that fear in others. Manipulation doesn't begin with confidence. It begins with anxiety, with the unbearable need to control outcomes. And when you don't feel safe enough to ask directly, you learn to shape people indirectly. They become experts in reading tone, in detecting where your guilt lives, in offering a compliment, only to pull it away when you hesitate. They learn that if they smile while doing it, you won't know whether to question them or yourself. And most times, you'll choose yourself, because they don't hit you. They don't humiliate you in public. They just rearrange your inner compass. One comment at a time. Until you stop trusting your own reactions, charm is their disguise, not because they're warm, but because they're calculated. Charm lowers your guard. It gives you the illusion of intimacy. And once you lean in, they can rewrite the rules while you're still looking for the ones you thought you were playing by. They'll use guilt, make you feel like not meeting their needs is an act of betrayal. They'll cry at the right moment. Go silent at the wrong one. And it will feel like it's your job to fix what you didn't break. You'll replay conversations afterward. Try to find where you went wrong. You'll apologize for things you didn't do because they made you feel responsible for their discomfort. But this is not a warning. This is an awakening. Because now you begin to see what you couldn't before. You stop seeing a person. You start seeing a strategy, a pattern, a need for control, disguised as love. a fear of abandonment disguised as intensity, a hollow center hidden behind performance, and suddenly your empathy detaches, not because you've become cold, but because you've become clear. You no longer listen to what they say. You watch what they do when you say no. You test their silence. You let them sit in it. And you watch who breaks first, because truth is not in words, it's in reactions. And the manipulator's greatest fear is not being disliked. It's being irrelevant, powerless, ignored. So now you stop feeding them. You don't explain, you don't justify, you don't soften your voice to make them comfortable in their control. You see them, fully, not as evil, not as broken, just as someone trying to survive in a way that costs others their center. And once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. And once you name it, you no longer bend to it. Now, you move differently, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with precision and distance, and the quiet strength that comes from seeing the strings and choosing never to dance again. You used to believe loyalty meant something. That if you gave your all, they would stay. That if you showed up, honest, raw, unguarded, someone would meet you with the same. Because you thought loyalty was built on love, on shared struggle, on truth. But loyalty, more often than not, is a mask, worn when it's convenient, kept on when it's profitable, dropped the moment the script changes. They weren't lying when they said they cared. They just didn't mean it the way you did. Because for them, loyalty was a transaction, a currency, and the moment the cost outweighed the benefit, they left. You didn't see it coming, not because you were blind, but because you believed. Belief makes you generous. It softens the edges of behavior that should have warned you. It tells you to wait, to understand, to forgive. But loyalty that needs to be proven is already gone. You begged for clarity in silence, hoped that distance was just a phase. But silence is an answer. So is absence. And still, you waited. You held the weight of both people's promises. You defended them to yourself. Because the story of loyalty was more comforting than the truth of abandonment. What no one tells you is that loyalty is rarely about principle. It's about utility. People stay where they are fed, where they feel seen, where the cost of leaving outweighs the discomfort of staying. And when those conditions shift, so do they. Not with cruelty, but with indifference. They fade, they forget. They move on as if you were a season that passed, not a storm they survived. You thought love was the anchor. But love without loyalty is just memory. And loyalty without consistency is just a story you tell yourself to feel safe. But now you know. Loyalty cannot be demanded, and it should never be expected. Because waiting for others to stay is a passive form of self-betrayal. It asks you to remain still, while they decide whether or not you're worthy of constancy. And that stillness, that waiting, is how you lose yourself. There's a mourning that happens here, the death of an old truth, the ache of watching the pedestal crack, of realizing they were never who you thought they were, only who you needed them to be. This grief is not weakness. It's clarity. It's the pain of shedding illusions you didn't know you'd wrapped around your heart. But once they're gone, what's left is something quieter and stronger. Because now, you stop looking for loyalty in others. You start building it within, to your values, to your peace. To the version of you that doesn't wait to be chosen, because you've already chosen yourself. And from that place, you expect nothing. Not because you're bitter, but because you are free. Trust no one fully, and you will never be enslaved by disappointment. It sounds harsh, but in truth, it's the most honest love you can give yourself. No more contracts unspoken, no more debts unpaid, no more shrinking so someone else feels taller. You no longer mourn who left. You honor who remained, you, not out of loneliness, but out of sovereignty, because loyalty is not what binds you anymore. Clarity is, and that is a freedom no one can take. You don't need to raise your voice to be feared. You don't need to strike the table or stare someone down. True fear, the kind that bends a room without a sound, comes from something quieter. It comes from presence, from the energy of a person who cannot be moved without permission. You were taught to soften your edges, to explain yourself when misunderstood, to prove your kindness before it's questioned. But fear doesn't grow in the presence of explanation. It grows in silence, in stillness, in the space where others are left wondering where your limit begins and what happens when it's crossed. You don't need to become cruel to be untouchable. You just need to become clear. Clarity is dangerous because it removes the room for manipulation. It doesn't allow others to write your story with their projections. It doesn't play games, doesn't engage in emotional negotiations. It simply is. And when someone cannot predict you, they begin to fear the rules they don't know. To be feared without becoming cold is not about domination. It's about becoming sovereign, no longer signaling to the world that you need to be liked in order to stay centered. You begin by honoring your no like a sacred boundary. No apologies, no softening, just presence. People will test you, not because they hate you, but because they need to know where your edge is. And when they find it, you do not flinch, you do not raise your tone, you simply enforce the cost. Because power is not about threat, it's about consequence. You don't explain why you left, you leave. You don't warn them that they've gone too far, you vanish. And in that emptiness, they meet the weight of your absence. Not to punish, but to teach. Fear is not about harm. It's about knowing that you cannot be coerced, that you are not afraid of being misunderstood, that you are no longer in the business of proving yourself to people who confuse closeness with control. You become feared the moment you stop performing. When your face holds still even when provoked, when your energy doesn't chase comfort, when your silence becomes sharper than your voice, and that silence, it starts to shape your reputation. People begin to feel it before you speak. They sense that you do not operate from need. You do not beg for inclusion. You are not a negotiable presence. This isn't about being cold. It's about being untouchable by chaos. It's about holding the storm inside you so still that others wonder if they imagined it at all. You don't radiate aggression. You radiate restraint. And that is what makes you feared. Because people trust those they can predict, but they respect those they cannot manipulate. This kind of presence isn't built overnight. It's carved through every decision to stay calm when provoked, to hold your line when pushed, to walk away without a sound, until people start adjusting themselves, not because you demanded it, but because they don't want to risk losing access to your quiet. And in that stillness, in that disciplined quiet, you become the thing no one dares to test. Not because you're cruel, but because you are no longer available to be disrespected. You've wasted too much time trying to be understood, explaining your silence, clarifying your boundaries, softening your tone so the truth wouldn't sting. But there comes a moment when you realize the need to be understood is the last thread of control. You want them to know your heart, because you believe that if they see it clearly, they won't misuse it. But people are not built that way. They see what serves them. They listen for weakness, not truth. They hear apologies as permission. And the more you explain, the more power you bleed. So now, you stop. This is not about bitterness. It's about precision, a shift from emotional noise to inner stillness, not because you don't feel, but because you know when to stop showing what you feel. Detachment is not indifference. It's discipline. It's the decision to place your emotions where they cannot be used against you. They provoke you and you don't respond. They disappear and you don't chase. They lie and you let them. Because you've learned that the person who reacts first always loses. People are not consistent. They are ruled by need, by fear, by the impulse to be seen, even if it means deceiving. And if you tie your peace to their chaos, you will always be at war. So you begin to choose silence over defense, distance over closeness, unavailability over being endlessly accessible. Not because you hate, but because you've seen too much. There is power in knowing what you will not respond to. There is clarity in choosing what dies in silence. You don't argue with liars. You don't plead with the disloyal. You don't mourn when masks fall. You simply adjust. You watch. You learn. You adapt. This is the art of detachment, not numbness, awareness, not isolation, sovereignty. You stop giving people access to the places in you they haven't earned. You stop expecting consistency from those addicted to their own instability. You begin to operate from a place of reserve, where your emotions are yours again. They don't get to see when you're hurt. They don't get to know when you're thinking of them. They don't get to hold your softness in their hands like something breakable. Now you hold it, and they adjust, or they vanish. But either way, you do not bend. You don't send the message. You don't write the long paragraph. You don't offer yourself like proof that your heart was real. Because the truth is, they knew. They just didn't care the way you did. And when you see that, when you truly let that sink in, you don't need closure. You don't need revenge. You don't need a reason. You just let go. And what fills the space is not anger. It's a cold, clear sky. Quiet, unmoving. You breathe deeper. You sleep better. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head because you've remembered something sacred. Not everyone deserves to witness your reaction. Some things are not worth touching twice. Some people are not worth explaining to. And some endings are better left unanswered. Not because you didn't care, but because you finally do. About yourself. They expect you to speak, to fill the air with your defense, your reasoning, your wounds. Because the world has taught them that silence is absence, when in truth, silence is presence concentrated. You used to rush to explain yourself, to soften the blow of your boundaries, to cushion the edge of your no with reasons and justifications. But now you've learned, power is not in how loud you speak, but in when you choose not to. Silence unsettles people. Not because they don't hear you, but because they don't know what you're thinking. And when someone can't read you, they begin to question themselves. They reveal more than they mean to, just to fill the void you left untouched. This is your advantage. Because silence is not passive, it is surgical. It is sharp enough to cut through performance. When you speak less, people begin to show you more. Not for your benefit, but to soothe their own discomfort. And in that unraveling, they expose their fears, their lies, their masks. You don't interrupt. You watch. You listen, not just to words, but to patterns. To the way someone stumbles when you don't rescue the conversation. To the way their eyes shift when you don't offer approval. To the way their mask cracks in the weight of your stillness. You learn to hold the pause. To let the silence stretch past comfort. Because in that space, truth breathes. And you are no longer afraid of what it reveals. Silence becomes your shield. Not because you are weak, but because you are no longer willing to waste your voice on those who aren't listening. You conserve your energy like a weapon sheathed, not always seen, but always present. It is the restraint that makes them question your capacity, because they know, if this is how calm you are when pushed, how much sharper could you be when you choose to speak? Now your silence is no longer empty. It is filled with decisions. It is the space where your dignity sits, where your standards breathe, where your peace lives, untouched by noise. They will accuse you of being cold. They will call your silence arrogance. But that's only because your stillness reveals their noise. Because without your reaction, they have no mirror. And without your attention, they have no power. This is not about detachment. This is about control, choosing the exact moment your words matter most. Holding your truth like fire, not to light every room, but to burn only when necessary. You speak only when the silence has done its work, after the masks fall, after the game is revealed. You don't rush, because you know the quieter you are, the more they fear what you might say. This isn't about winning the conversation. It's about owning the atmosphere. When your presence speaks louder than your mouth ever could, let them talk. Let them circle themselves into revelation. You don't need to prove you're right. You need only to remain still long enough for the truth to collapse on its own. Because now, your silence is not the absence of voice. It is the presence of power. And it waits, with precision, with patience, with purpose. You walk into a room and say nothing, but you're already listening. Not to the words, but to the silence between them. Not to what people claim, but to what their bodies betray. The mouth can lie, but the eyes flinch before betrayal. The hands tense before attack. The smile curves too tightly when loyalty is false. You've been caught off guard before. Surprised by the ones who smiled while they carved the wound. But not anymore. Now, you read the room like a weapon reads intention, with clarity, with calculation, without mercy. Everyone reveals themselves. They just do it quietly. In who they interrupt and who they ignore. In who they laugh with and who they look past. Power isn't loud, it's observational. And you've trained your eye to see what others miss. You notice who flatters too quickly. The excessive praise wrapped in sugar, designed to lower your guard. That's not admiration, it's pre-positioning. They want something, and your silence makes them nervous. You pay attention to who challenges you in front of others, but softens when you're alone. That's not honesty, it's performance. They want to assert power without earning it. You let them speak, because the more they show, the easier they are to map. You begin to trust pattern over promise. Who always arrives late, who changes tone when authority enters the room, who speaks of unity but thrives in division. You don't react, you just record, mentally, quietly, relentlessly. This is not paranoia, it's precision. You're not looking for enemies. You're identifying liabilities. Because when you know who is likely to crack, you already know where the collapse will begin. You no longer confuse kindness with loyalty. You've learned that some smiles are rehearsed, some apologies are tactical, and some cries are just noise. So you observe their eyes when your name is spoken, their voice when they think you're not listening, their posture when they believe they've won. That's where the truth lives. And you've become fluent in it. Now, instinct is no longer wild. It's trained. It doesn't just sense danger, it categorizes it. It places people into frames, the unstable, the opportunist, the loyal, the weak. Not to judge, but to prepare. You don't accuse, you anticipate. You don't expose, you reposition. Power lies in the space between knowing and revealing. And you've mastered that silence. Every interaction is a negotiation. Every glance a message. You read tone before language, energy before gesture. You stop waiting for people to tell you who they are. You listen to what they can't hide, because foresight is protection. It's the difference between being betrayed and being ready. You used to wonder why things collapsed. Now you know they were never solid to begin with. You just didn't see it yet. But now you see everything. And they don't even know they've already told you. You no longer beg to be seen clearly. You've outgrown the need to be fully understood. Now, you choose what they see, and what remains in shadow. There is power in illusion, not lies. but precision. You don't show the whole map. You give them a single landmark. The rest stays buried beneath your silence. Reputation becomes your armor, not built on perfection, but on consistency. A curated version of you, just enough to command respect, never enough to be decoded. You're no longer predictable. You're studied, but never fully known. They think they know you, but what they hold is a mask you handed them, and they hold it with reverence. Because when people can't place you, they fear misstepping. They approach with caution, uncertain of your reach, your rules, your retribution. This is emotional camouflage, the art of being present and unreadable. You speak in layers. Truth wrapped in suggestion, vulnerability timed like strategy, charm laced with warning. Because you've learned something vital. When people believe they see all of you, they stop respecting you. They assume access means ownership, so you give them just enough to satisfy their curiosity, but never enough to predict your next move. The mistake you once made was thinking sincerity was owed, that if you were honest enough, open enough, they wouldn't hurt you. But sincerity, in the wrong hands, becomes a blueprint for destruction. So now, you've learned to be selective with truth, not deceitful, tactical. You don't correct their misconceptions. You let them assume. You let them guess wrong. Because every false belief they build around you becomes another layer of your control. Now you move through the world like smoke. Present, shifting, untouchable. You don't anchor yourself in the expectations of others. You rewrite the script as you walk. Today you're gentle, tomorrow you're steel, and they learn not to guess twice. You no longer react, you orchestrate. They step into a room and feel your presence before you speak. They adjust their tone without knowing why. Not because you've demanded it, but because the weight of your silence carries more force than their performance. You've become a master of suggestion, a raised eyebrow, a delayed reply, a still gaze, all more effective than shouting ever was. They feel your power in what you choose not to say. This is the transformation. When you stop trying to win people and start becoming the kind of presence they cannot ignore. You move like myth, always seen, never grasped, and in that distance you are respected. You've stopped offering explanations, stopped giving the benefit of the doubt to those who never earned it. Now you give consequence. Now you give absence. Now you give silence when words once begged for clarity. They won't understand how you became this. They'll think it happened suddenly. But this is the result of every moment you were misunderstood, every time vulnerability was turned against. You've learned. And now you design yourself, not for their comfort, but for your sovereignty. Unreachable, unrattled, unwritten by anyone but you. You no longer ask who might betray you. You've stopped scanning the room for safety because you've realized there is no safety outside yourself, only illusions and leverage. To fear no one is not a performance. It is not loud, not aggressive, not theatrical. It is the stillness that comes after every mask has dropped, and you've seen what people really are beneath their smiles. It is the silence of someone who knows they can't be touched, not because they're invisible, but because they are untouchable where it matters most. You've been broken before. But what broke was the illusion, not your core. What shattered was the fantasy that others would protect you. Now you protect yourself, not with walls, but with clarity. You see through charm, through threat, through manipulation. You don't flinch, you don't chase, you don't explain. There is no fear in you now, because fear requires dependence, and you've burned the parts of yourself that used to beg for permission. No more waiting to be understood. No more shrinking to fit into softer narratives. You are no longer digestible. You are no longer palatable. You are what survives when approval becomes irrelevant. You've studied people long enough to understand the quiet game beneath their words. You've heard their threats, seen their tactics, watched them posture. And still, you remain calm. Not because you trust them, but because you trust your response to them. That's real power. You don't enter a room to be liked. You enter it with your soul already intact. Whether they embrace you or exile you, you stay centered, unbothered, unapologetic. Your presence is not a request, it's a fact, and they will either adjust or vanish. You used to explain your silence. Now, your silence explains you. You used to soften your edges. Now your edge is the reason they don't cross you. You've become the type of person who moves without being seen. But when you strike, there is no doubt who delivered the blow. You don't retaliate to everything. You conserve. You measure. You wait. Because fear belongs to those who are reactive. You've become deliberate, surgical. Even your stillness has a blade in it. What you've built inside yourself can't be touched by betrayal or threatened by rejection. You've built it in silence, with the wreckage of every false friendship, every manipulation, every mask you stripped off your own face. To fear no one doesn't mean you trust everyone. It means you understand that nobody's power over you is permanent, unless you hand it to them. And you've stopped handing yourself over. Now you belong to no one. Not even the past versions of yourself who begged, explained, apologized. They're gone. What's left is elemental, disciplined, detached, and precise. You walk like you own nothing, because nothing owns you. You carry no debt to their opinions, no chain of expectation, only silence and strategy. This is what it means to be sovereign. To walk away without flinching, to be uninvited and still at peace, to be feared, not because you are cruel, but because you no longer need to be kind to be left alone. You are not a monster. You are not a saint. You are simply done. Done fearing. Done explaining. Done kneeling. Now you move like a shadow, strike like a ghost, and answer to no one.